Life is serious.
Yep.
Raising children is serious. Having children is serious. But every conversation doesn't need to be serious.
Correct. Yep.
Every conversation. And so for me, if I could bring the word adoption up in a
Casually.
casual way, saying their story, oh my goodness, your neighbor was adopted, my kids were adopted too. It brings a connection,
Yeah.
right? It brings a connection and it creates those informal conversations.
Welcome to A Place of Yes, a podcast about how I moved through my darkest hour. And for me, that was in channeling my grief into good. Welcome to the show. So we are here today with Francine Apy of Soul Filling, and we are going to talk about a lot of the things we talk about all the time. You know, the talking about grief and how to channel your grief for good, all the different ways that grief, both traditional grief and then sort of ambiguous grief, how they impact our lives. So Francine, can you share with the audience a little bit about yourself and tell us about Soul Filling and your work?
I started Soul Filling. Actually, we just celebrated a first anniversary.
Congratulations.
In June. Yeah, but I think Soul Filling's kind of been in the works, in the making for a long time. So my background is in HR leadership. I retired a little bit earlier than expected and was looking for, what was my next chapter going to look like. And quite honestly, I loved the HR field and I loved, helping people, coaching and performance management. But when I really sat and thought about what I wanted to do, I knew I wanted to give back to the adoption community in some way. So we formed our family through the blessing of adoption. We have 3 children, 23. My middle son just turned 20 this week and soon to be 18.
Wow.
There's 11 grandchildren in our family. I'm the youngest of 4 girls.
Okay.
Not of the 11 of us, 8 of which are adopted.
Okay.
So we have adoption in my personal, my immediate family, as well as nieces and nephews. One thing that I just experienced while raising my children have all known from the minute that they were born that they were adopted. And we made the conversation as open and casual and, it was part of their story. It was a piece of their story.
Okay.
I was an amazing birth mothers. I was in the delivery room for all 3. I cut the cord for all 3. And literally from the minute they were born, having conversations with them using the word adoption.
Okay. So just, it was never not
it was, I wanted them.
There wasn't this
that,
like sit down. It was just a.
And it just grew from that, right? It just grew from that. So age appropriate, incorporating, what that word means and how they can understand that word. And I did make them each a photo album. And I made a copy for myself and a copy for them that shared all the pictures that I had of their birth families mixed with our family to begin to formulate that there are other people
story
in the story.
Can you tell the audience, hopefully if it's not too personal, but how did you come to adoption and how did you come to meet the birth mothers?
Sure.
Okay.
So long story short is from as long as I can remember, I wanted to be a mom. In my mind, not being a mom just was not an option.
Okay. Yep.
Never was not an option. My husband and I early on, we wanted to adopt, even if I was able to give birth, adoption was always on our heart from early on. And so I did infertility and I did it for a very brief time. It wasn't the right fit for me. I knew I wanted science is there for a reason and I wanted to try it. And the last in vitro failed and my amazing doctor, he cried. I said, Dr. John, why are you crying? He said, I don't understand. Women come to me because he's a little bit better statistics and they come filled like you with hope and joy. And then I can't help everybody, but most of them leave angry and upset with me. And you're not. Why? I said, because there's a bigger plan. I'm going to become a mom. It's not going to happen this way.
Deep down, you knew that you'd figure it out.
100%.
Yeah.
When you want to adopt, you create a profile and you basically write with letters and pictures to the birth mother, sharing with them your story and if they would consider you as the adoptive family. And so I had sent those far and wide, school counselors, hospitals, doctors' offices. And long story short, that was October that I got that news. And I received my first phone call from my birth mother in November.
Oh, wow.
And my son was born in December.
Oh, wow.
So,
okay. Is that typical?
No.
Okay.
But I'm sure many people can share that story.
That they've had similar experiences.
They had similar experiences, yes. In all 3 of my situations, they were all just private adoptions.
Okay.
It was grassroots. And so at the time, this was 23 years ago, we set up a separate phone line, our adoption line. So when that phone rang, we knew that it was somebody calling and to talk about choosing us or discussing with us an adoption plan for their child.
The universe has such a way, right? I mean, I say that a lot.
The universe has such a way, and it's so much bigger than what we can see. And I'd be lying to Heather if I didn't have sadness, if I didn't feel frustrated, like with the whole process sometimes in terms of wanting to have a child. Like if you're a motivated person, you go to college, you get your job, you want a promotion, you work hard, and you do all the things.
You set me up beautifully. We talk so often about that, right? And so often in life, you never know when it's going to be that thing, right? I got into the college I wanted to go to. I got the job I wanted to go to. Your life goes along in this way, and you never quite know when the ball is going to drop, where your hardship's going to be, or where your avenue of grief. And I talk a lot, when I started this podcast, it was very, very much about the loss of my son, Jake. And Jake, he passed away when he was 4 years old. He had a really medically complex life. Because of Jake and post-Jake has really taken this turn and turned into something different and something that I'm pretty proud of, right? Because I feel like I keep Jake's memory alive. I share his story. And his story gives me the strength to sort of talk about other things with other people. And I do think you're touching on something that is also grief, right? You expected a certain way to become a mom, and that didn't work out. I can see in your face how happy you are in the experiences and that you are a mom and that you have 3 boys, young adults. And even when you talk about the phone ringing, I can see it. So you have that joy of motherhood. Is there that feeling of it's not the way you thought it was going to be?
I have to say, I really just knew in my heart that this is the path. To say I wasn't disappointed to have the experience to carry a child, is it going to carry traits of mine or my husband's? And really, at the end of the day, when I really thought about it, many of the people that I love the most and care about the most that I'm closest with are not blood relatives. And I knew in my heart, I had been babysitting since I was 10 years old, and I knew that I wanted to be a mom since I could write. I was like, yeah. Absolutely. I could love a child that so deeply that I didn't, and of course the connection that my son and I had, right from the get-go and as we continued to grow our family. But there are definitely those moments. And I think we all have that choice. Are we going to stay there and remain stuck and feel sorry for ourselves? I think there's a point that we all have to do that. But there comes a time you have to stand up and say, I have the rest of my life to live. I could meet people that could be some of my best experiences and people.
The best could still yet to come.
Yet to come. And as I say, the people in my journey, the stories that are on their way to me that I can't even imagine what they are, wouldn't be if my story was different. So I really just had to embrace that. You have to look at your life kind of allowing it to unfold.
Yep.
And not that you have to like every chapter. Like I talk about this, I'm in the process of writing a book and I'm collecting 33 stories at a time relative to adoption that focus on when things go right. Can we focus on that for a minute? And also when they don't go right, what did you do to help get on the right path again and again and again? Because we don't only have to do that once.
No, and
we have to do it again and again and again.
We talk about it a lot with people on the show and about, just grief in general, whether it's grieving the loss of someone or whether it's grieving the loss of the life you thought you were going to have or whatever it is. All of the things. There can be this healthy balance, right? Because I do think you can't just push it away and,
100%
you got to be in it sometimes, right? And you got to feel it. But then you have to know that moment when you can continue to move on. Because your life is not just the one moment, right? It's all of these different things. Did you become friends or in any way with the birth moms, or were they kind of you met in that chapter and then you close that door, or are you still connected to them?
So in our situation, again, our children are older than an adoption today. But in our situation, it was open from the standpoint of we did pictures and letters through the attorney twice a year. So they could send me pictures and letters. I could send them pictures and letters. And it was always the understanding that when the time was right, if it was right for birth mother, right for children, right for our whole family, we would meet someday.
Okay.
And so 2 of my children have met their birth mothers.
Okay.
And the reunions were great. It's what they wanted. It was the right time. I couldn't be happier for them. It was just one of those situations, and I love talking to people about it, it's just so natural. Like people would say, Fran, doesn't it hurt your feelings? Or a lot of adoptees don't want to talk about their birth families because they feel like it would make their adoptive family or their family that they're
You worry about
raise
other
their-
people's feelings,
their
right?
other
You're
feelings,
always, yep.
and that we're not appreciative or that we're not grateful for this, and understanding the story of why adoption was the right option. But still, at the end of the day, I mean, I couldn't encourage my kids enough. It's natural.
You just want to know sometimes, probably,
That's
right?
right.
Like it's,
That's right. I always say our children are going to go through all the stages, right? They're going to go through, adolescence and teenage years,
All
and
the
they're going to
things.
like you, and then they're not going to like you.
regardless of it. Yeah,
Regardless, right? Whether you were adopted or
Yeah,
not.
no, it's
However, when you're raising your family through the blessing of adoption, there's another lens.
There's
And that
one more
lens
layer.
It's
Yep.
another lens, and that lens is adoption, right? And so it's just being mindful and sensitive to that.
So you said 2 out of 3. So the third,
Has no interest.
no interest. Your son or the mom or both?
From my son's perspective, and that's who I lead with.
Yeah, of course.
Right. And that's what I always said, because two of my children were very vocal from very young age. And they'd be like, I want to meet my birth mom. And I said, that's great. But you have to remember, it has to be a good time for her.
Yep.
It has to be a good time for our family based on the other dynamics and things that are going on.
Otherwise, it's not going to be.
It's
yeah.
not going to work.
Yeah.
So you can't wake up one day and feel like this is
Today's
a good
the day.
time.
Yeah.
So I was always very respectful to my birth moms to say, I will always reach out to you and make sure it's a good time.
Yep.
Because they have full lives
Yep.
too,
How old were they when they met them, and how did it go?
Great. My one son was 15,
Okay.
going on 16, and my other son was 16.
Okay.
To be completely honest, it was almost like a non-event, only because we just shared so much with them. They saw photographs of them
Yep.
over the years. They saw pictures of their birth families, my birth mother, or my children's birth mothers. It was, of course, special. And of course, I was so grateful, and they were so grateful. It wasn't like this big event, like that they had gone all these years never knowing what they look like or what to talk about.
Well, and the fact that you said it has always been part of their story from
Always
that
been part of
very
the story.
Then there's never this. And that's kind of why I asked, was there a time when you had a conversation? And not that I know this personally or firsthand, but just TV or just the way the world kind of sometimes views adoption, right? It's like, oh, there has to be this big sit down, and it has to be this formal thing. And I think the fact that you have approached it in such a, I hate using the word normal, but in such
casual.
this is casual. This is just the way it is. And I think in today's world, right, families look so different. All families look different, and that's great. It doesn't all have to look the same.
Yeah, and not to say, I certainly would never want to speak for them. I just think, I'm sure they had moments of feeling like, I wish it was different, or I wish this was different.
So that was going to be.
But didn't you growing up?
Well, that's
didn't you?
100%.
I'm the youngest of 4 girls in 5 years. Love my sisters, love my parents, have a great life and story. But who loves every chapter of their story? No one.
And you're always wanting a life different than yours, right? I think that's part of the growing up thing. I was an only child. I invented siblings, right? I just was so desperate for I was so jealous of my friends who had siblings. And then so many people would say oh, I wish I was an only child. You always want something different, or you can't. It's
you
just,
can't help.
and part of that is the growing up process, right? It's just the teenage years you referenced.
That's
it wasn't easy when we went through them. It's not easy parenting through them.
That's right. And, I just can't say enough to my kids of just how respectful they've been of my husband and I. We were very candid with them. I don't have all the answers, and I wish I had all the answers. Yeah. And one of the things with my mission in creating Soul Filling is to bring to light those stories when things do go right. But as I mentioned, also bringing in the tools and the resources and the team when things aren't going right. And one of the things we experienced while raising our children is there weren't very many therapists or counselors versed in therapy around adoption. Okay. And it was shocking to me. And it never ceases to amaze me that they just didn't have this lens of adoption in their back pocket. And I felt like I was doing all this reading to try to do the right thing.
To make sure that you would say the right thing.
To set them up, right? And so one of the things, I'm partnering with this company, Center for Adoption Support and Education out of Baltimore.
Okay.
And they do amazing work with training therapists on adoption.
Okay. Well, you touch on something important that I think a lot of our guests on this show, and something that I kind of work on, it's, whatever your story is, there are always those areas where you wish there was something different, right? I remember when Jake first got sick. He was 8 months old, just turned 2007. It felt so lonely, right? It wasn't the days now of Instagram and TikTok.
Find a group. You can get a group
yeah,
online.
Facebook was sort of around, I guess. I remember feeling so alone alone. Like when I came home from the hospital with him and when trying to find other moms like me, other kids like Jake, other families like, for Ethan. I love that now I can be that person that didn't exist for me. You're kind of touching on that too, right? Like you went through this kind of specific experience and your kids went through this specific experience, but there were holes in it. So now you are filling those for other people.
Gaps that we just couldn't fill.
But now you can be that person or that advocate or that conduit, kind of like to get people to the places that they need to be. And I feel like that's regardless what the story is. I think when we can become who we needed when we were in it, I just think that's such a great way to give back.
Exactly. And that really takes me back to your initial question, which why soul filling, right? I really sat with it and I was like, number one, I don't think we talk enough about adoption in a positive light of when things just go right and sharing those stories. Number two, I think, one of my taglines is to make the conversation of adoption more mainstream at home, work, and school. I would say, oh, my children are adopted. Everyone knew my children. If they didn't, no, they weren't. Oh, I'm so sorry. It always would leave, I'm so sorry.
So,
well, no, I'm sharing it to educate, to communicate.
That I'm so sorry, right? Like that is a constant with our guests. I don't always know why people say it. Don't say I'm sorry.
Because you don't want to feel pity.
Yeah,
It was like this pity
and it feels like they are projecting that your life or your child or whatever is not enough. And you're like, no, it's enough. Like, don't you dare. Like a mama bear almost.
You protect.
Yes.
You protect.
Adoption is an area where people aren't always comfortable talking about. I think it's weird that people would say, I'm sorry. But
I'm sorry, I didn't know. And I'm like, there's nothing to be sorry
No,
about,
like it's just, there's nothing to be sorry about.
Yeah, so often when people would say, I'm sorry, like we were saying, I think it's in good intentions, right? But there's this automatic feeling like something's not right, something was wrong, and something didn't go the way you expected it to go. For me, it wasn't that I felt like I needed to be on a soapbox and get adoption lead in the first 5 minutes of the conversation. Everyone needed to know that our children were adopted. But for me, it was a way to bring the conversation, even in the early days, when my kids were young, bring that topic of adoption in a casual, informal way. Life is serious.
Yep.
Raising children is serious. Having children is serious. But every conversation doesn't need to be serious.
Correct. Yep.
Every conversation. And so for me, if I could bring the word adoption up in a casual way, saying their story, oh my goodness, your neighbor was adopted, my kids were adopted too. It brings a connection.
It becomes, and taboo's not the right word, but it becomes
the stigma.
It becomes a stigma
that it's not enough. That,
and
like
that
you said it.
Yeah, and I think that just normalizing it or just having it be like, it is what it is.
It is part of the story. Yeah. And so for me, bringing it up, I often would bring it up like when they were starting school. And of course, my children knew that they were adopted from a very young age. And I would say, hey, I'm going to mention to your new teacher. Because for me, I always wanted them, when the topic came up, I wanted them to feel good about it. I wanted them to know that was something that they could share more about or had the choice not to, but I didn't want them to be taken off guard, by somebody saying, no, you're not, because my kids happen to resemble my husband and I, and it just happened that way.
Okay.
And they'll say, you were not. And when they got older, I knew they could really stand up for themselves. But when they were younger,
no, that's a hard. How do you come back to that?
To their story of adoption, to be told, no, you weren't, was something
by an
Mama
adult
Bear,
likely too, right? So they're a kid and they're that's confusing
so
and
I
weird.
Didn't want the teachers. So sometimes the teachers and coaches would look at me and be like, really? And I'm like, really? Just to spin off, if I can, just on the book that I recently wrote, Brianna's Brave Day at School, is based on a situation that actually happened to my son in first grade, when a little girl said, wow, you must have been a very bad boy for your mom not to want you.
Oh,
and
Lord.
His hand went up and I won't tell you the story, but I was so incredibly proud of him, of how he spoke in terms of his story and what adoption means. And I'll never forget when his teacher at pickup at the end of the day came up to me. She's like, I need to talk to you about it. And I'm like, what's going on? She said, you would have been really proud, because she didn't know she didn't mean what she was saying. She didn't mean to say, but to be able to articulate at that level, at a first grade level, and begin those conversations, I'm sure for your son, having to go to school and, see his peers and have them talk about their brother and, sometimes when we don't know what to say, we say the wrong thing.
when we don't, and I hate saying the word normalize, but when we don't just have these conversations openly,
Or the language,
right?
just
when
the
we
language.
don't, because people don't talk about adoption, so then adoption becomes this stigmatized or this thing where we are uncomfortable with it. Like
Make
you
up
said,
our own
we make up
stories.
our own story, and I'm sure the 7-year-old first grader was not the nicest, but she was, she's just picking up on sort of these things because we're not just putting out there that this is one way that families are created. It is,
and that's exactly the
Yeah.
conversation that, this teacher said we didn't do the lesson as planned. And
Yeah.
we talked about how families come together in all different ways.
in different ways. And the fact that you just had it as part of your son's stories from the get-go also does, because sometimes you hear these stories or you see it on TV where, it's never told and then when's the right time. And I think regardless of what that is, right? Whether it's loss or adoption or any of these things, you've got to have
Yes.
these, you're not doing anybody any favors by sweeping things under the rug.
No. Just to touch briefly on the history of adoption doesn't help us very much, right? Because 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago, you didn't talk about it. Adoption was very, very private. It was very quiet. Often the child, may not have even known that they were adopted or they found out from a neighbor. That's just the way adoption was.
Yeah.
And that's how, but it has evolved so much. Most adoptions that happen, there's some level of open adoption for birth family, adoptive family.
It's kind of this other intersection of what I typically talk about and why you fit so well into what I typically talk about. Because the other thing, too, is when you go back 20, 30, 40 years, and there's the topic of grief, and there's the topic of child loss specifically, people didn't talk about it, right? It's like that child never existed. And for me, that was no way that I could live. As a mom, I had 2 kids and yes, Jake is gone, but I'm still his mom. I had to figure out how to keep that balance. And I just think in both of these scenarios and so many other type of scenarios, but just the fact that the world now allows for these conversations. And
it needs the conversations.
It needs the conversations and that we can have them with people.
It's never too late to start. And I love that is one good thing about social media in terms of bringing people together and feeling more comfortable with talking about things that maybe are more difficult. But at the end of the day, I'm finding these groups, I'm like, this is amazing. I love that at this age that you're able to tap into what you need now going forward.
Yes.
And for me, that's invigorating.
Yep.
If I'm able to reach any families or any people thinking about adoption, considering adoption, and creating this new conversation around adoption that I don't think anybody else is talking about in terms of just the things we're talking about here and how adoption has evolved and how more people just need to feel just a little bit more comfortable with the topic, even in this day and age.
100%. Just
mainstream at homework and school.
So sometimes you hear stories of adoptions that just, I don't always love to use the word trauma, but that there's more baggage, more trauma involved with it. As your experience, with soul filling or in being sort of an advocate or a consultant, have you come across some of those? Not necessarily your personal story, but just other stories?
Sure. I mean, I think I'd be remiss in any life, again, whether you have adoption in your story or not, we talk about trauma way more today than at least
before.
I did
100%.
growing up, right? When I grew up hearing about trauma, it was people coming out of war, that they literally went through war. And now we talk about it and it has so many different meanings to it, right? So there's trauma in adoption if child never knew they were adopted and they found out maybe after their family who raised them passed away and then they found out. That's trauma, coming to terms with what else did they not tell me?
That
all
dishonesty
the stories that go
yeah.
with that. Well, if they didn't tell me that, well, now they must not have liked that aspect that adoption. They didn't.
There's something wrong with me.
There's something wrong with me. Why did unless we're versed young adults that are confident in ourselves to realize that must have been very hard for them in something that they weren't able to do. It takes a very strong person, right, to be able to look on the other side
and see it through someone else's lens.
Not make it about themselves. So that trauma in and of itself, I hear about adoption often. That's where I go back to building your team. Again, whether you adopted your children or not, having resources that can help you through these is so important.
Absolutely. You talked earlier about the universe and about how sort of things things fall into place or whatnot.
Yeah.
So when Jake died, Ethan was in kindergarten. His kindergarten teacher, who he adored and we adored, prior to Jake passing away, he passed away in December. When she was a child, she lost her brother. So it was one of these, we didn't pick the team, she just happened to be his kindergarten teacher. But Mrs. Somoza was really just this gift, this angel. It is all about the team or about the community that is around you. And grief really is this universal feeling. Like we think about grief just often about loss.
Yeah.
And while it is about loss, it can be different kinds.
Yeah.
It's coming to terms with all those things and how you handle it.
And I think if nothing more of what's come out, I think more recently, at least in my adulthood, is the acceptance of getting help.
Yeah.
In acceptance of seeking out community,
Really?
regardless
Yeah.
of the topic, regardless, your child has ADHD or your child is, whatever, your child is incredibly smart and gets picked on for that, whatever
Yeah.
it is. Build your team, find your people.
So talk a little bit. You said that you were working on a book and you're telling people's stories. Can you share a little bit about like where you're finding the people, what the stories are?
It's up on my website, soulfillingadoption.com. I ask people to share their story with me. And so it's there. It's on my social media. And I'm not exaggerating. Almost 9 times out of 10, when I'm having conversations, someone will see my pendant, which is my interpretation of the adoption symbol. They'll be like, what is that? And I'll say it's my interpretation of the adoption symbol. Or I'll have on my soul-filling sweat. What's soul-filling? 9 times out of 10, they'll know somebody who was adopted, who's in the process of adopting. Then I'll start to talk with them and I'll share with them at that level. Would you be willing to share your story with me?
Okay.
And so my hope is, I want 33 at a time. So I'm not going to end at 33. I want to keep continuing.
Okay.
And the book I wrote as well, it will be a series. Brianna's got some things to do. And
I like that a lot.
It was really, actually, as just a quick sidebar, I read it at an elementary school for the first time last week. At the end of the story, this little girl raised her arm and she said, Mrs. Apy, my name is Lauren and I was adopted. And you could hear a pin drop in the room and they all looked at each other like, we didn't know that, and started all these conversations. So
that's so great. I mean, that's
to have kids, to have a book in their library to bring the topic of adoption up. And so I'll take a story of a young person in my 30s, or somebody older. And like I said, what did you do when you got stuck? If you got stuck along the way, how did you get unstuck?
Life isn't about the things that happen to us. It's what we do with the stuff that happens to us. Both of our stories are that, right? Like, you could have been like, I can't give birth to kids. And you could have gotten stuck there, but you didn't. You created this beautiful life for yourself. And that's what I think of my story too, right? Like, Jake passed. I hate that. I hate that for me. I hate it for Ethan, for my husband. All I can do is do the work that I do. We started a foundation to kind of keep his memory alive, to help other families like ours, other kids like Jake, and we move forward. A place of yes is really, it's exactly that. It's knowing that moment where you need to figure out how to unstick yourself, right? Or how to find joy again and how to embrace what,
close the gap and move forward with the path that you didn't choose for yourself.
Wouldn't life be great if everything that we wanted was just given to us? But I honestly think life is great because it's not that way, because we have to kind of find our own way and create our own joy and create our own things. And the things you have to work harder at, you appreciate more.
You
right?
do. And sometimes you don't realize that when you're in it, especially when you're 18,
often.
16, 17.
No.
But when you look back, right?
Those are the things that mean something a little bit more.
That's right. Instead of the things that, that were handed to you or came super easy, whether it's 100%. Academic or a job or whatever. The challenge is what makes it.
So we do have this segment called Ask Heather Anything. If you've got anything for me, here you go. I'm an open
question.
Book. Bring it on. I like it.
So you must know a lot of people. You must know so many people in Saratoga, because I think the community really supported you on your journey.
Absolutely. Saratoga is a great community.
Did you find it difficult sometimes when you were having a good day and you were in a good place, but you had to go to Hannaford because you needed groceries? And you bumped into, where I'm going.
Oh, I do know where you're going.
Do you get this question a lot?
No, I don't get this. No, I don't get this question a lot. I love this question. So I'm assuming you're going to say, I'll let you finish because I'm already starting to answer. But no,
you know what I'm going to say.
You're going to.
So you're in that good place and you go to the grocery store and there's a person that you adore and adore your family and adored your son. And she is sad
For me.
for you.
Yeah.
And you need to protect yourself because you're having a good day, but you want to be supportive to her, but you don't want to spiral.
So it's an excellent question. And I wish that I could answer it in this really graceful way that showed that I was this really mature, whole person. And however, less so now because I'm just really comfortable in my skin now and I'm really at peace with my story. But at different places in the last 13 years since Jake died, I've not been in that place, and my husband will laugh. Like one of the things I started kind of like chuckling when you said it was because there was a huge portion, and I still do this sometimes, hair in a ponytail, cap on, big sunglasses. Like that's my look. Like it's Heather Incognito. I often go out in town looking not at all like myself. Like I don't like
Protecting yourself.
Protecting myself. That's kind of how I protect myself. I wear big glasses. I put a baseball cap on. It's funny. Like people always assume like I'm an extrovert, but I'm really an introvert, right? Like I need a lot of like one-on-one quiet time. Like when I'm out, because a lot of what I do in talking about Jake and talking about grief and talking about those things, I love to talk about it, but it's so draining that I need to have a lot of time where I just kind of do protect myself. So I often am incognito. People wouldn't even see me, or they'd be like, "Oh, Heather looks horrible. We better leave her alone.
Go the other way.
Yeah, go the other way.
Go to produce.
I don't know what's
not going there.
I don't know what's happening with her today."
Yeah.
That was a good question. I have really enjoyed our conversation. I'm grateful that you reached out. I am glad that this worked out. There's so many ways that lives intersect, and I am really glad that you agreed to be a guest on A Place of Yes.
I so appreciate the opportunity, and the work you're doing is amazing. And I know you're reaching people that need to hear that message.
I hope so. Thank you for listening to A Place of Yes. Please follow us wherever you listen to your podcasts. If you really like this episode, please share it with a friend, anybody who might benefit from listening to this. It would make a world of difference if we could just reach more people and share the work that we do and the stories we want to tell. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel, leave us a thumbs up or leave us a comment. We would appreciate all that you can do. If you really like this episode, please share it with a friend or two.